And I know he's been doing a series of events about his wonderful new book. So maybe I'll just dive straight in. Reading the environmental history that Sunil has put together, I was impressed, Sunil, with a couple of things. One is the fact that it's a truly global history. And we talked about this, but for the audience, what I mean by that is most global environmental histories, or what purport to be global environmental histories, is written so much with a Western gaze. So they're focusing on the environment history as seen through the writings of specific Western environmentalists. I mean, Ram, I think, sitting here will know exactly what I mean. But also from the perspective of very much the colonial power as seen through colonial writings, which might be sometimes self-critical of this in part, but it's still one gaze, it's on one part of the world, or it's largely really the West. And what you have is a truly global history. I mean, you have Polynesia, you have West Africa, you have Latin America, you have different parts of Asia, and then of course you have the US and the UK and Columbus, as we said, Columbus has to be there. So what I wanted to ask you first is, because I think as the audience is coming in, many of them would have a sense from the blurb, but I don't think the blurb can quite do justice to the scale of what you're trying to do. So I'm just curious, how would you summarize your book? And maybe would you like to read a couple of sections for them to get a flavor? Because I'm also struck by, I think, the power of the writing itself.
Thank you so much, Harini. It's nice to be here with all of you and to have a chance to have this conversation with Harini, whose work I admire so much. I'd like to start with what you just pointed out, Harini, which is that with the very notable exception of Ram Guha, who I'm happy is here today, the majority of works of global environmental history have been written by scholars whose original training and expertise is in the history of either Europe or North America. Many of those histories are global in terms of using examples and cases from around the world. But when I was first asked whether I'd want to write a book like this, I said, no, I didn't. And then I thought about it, and I thought, well, maybe there is a value to seeing what global environmental history looks like from the point of view of someone who's been trained primarily as a historian of South Asia and Southeast Asia, as I have, but also someone who grew up in Southeast Asia. I grew up in Singapore with deep connections to India as well. And the question in my mind is, would the story look different? I think it does look different. And I think it looks different because what I set out to do in The Burning Earth was to tell a story that's polyphonic and a set of multiple stories and narratives about how we reached this point of planetary environmental crisis. So not just a linear story, but one which interweaves familiar themes of imperialism and domination and exploitation with a counterpoint of examples and voices from around the world where alternative visions have been offered, where there has been resistance to these seemingly linear paths of environmental destruction and ruin. And I wanted to do that really by casting a wide net and trying to the best of my ability to do this in a way that is truly global, that doesn't restate older, familiar narratives which continue to be very Eurocentric.
And I think polyphonic is for me a really good description of that, because you have these multiple stories. I mean, for instance, what I was very struck by is when you talk about rice, you're talking about India and the shifting of the Gangetic play. I mean, the way the Ganga drains into now the Brahmaputra, and what that does to the changing rice. And then you immediately shift to China, and you're looking at rice in China, and you're also talking about the Mongols. So you have this sense of a connection of ecologies and places and environments. Right?
Yeah, I think it's the connections that I was trying hardest in The Burning Earth, I think, to capture. Anyone else looking at the same infinite range of possibilities would have made different connections. But the ones that I was following, based on my own intuition, based on the reading I've done, based on the research I've done, were those, some of which have not been highlighted so much in the way we think about global environmental history, some of which are perhaps surprising. I do choose to start with the Mongol Empire because, in a way, it is one of the first ecologically transformative empires. Just the sheer transfer of plants, of people, of ecologies, but there's also a self-consciousness about it. I think this is what's very interesting about the Mongol Empire. they are thinking about the world in terms of different landscapes. They are thinking about the world in terms of environmental transformation. There's a debate at the heart of the Mongol Empire about whether they want to turn China into pasture land or whether they want to work with the wet rice cultivation that they find there. So in terms of the big ecological dilemmas that we face, that seemed to me sort of an interesting place to begin.
So would you like to read a couple of sections?
I'll start. This is from the introduction to the book, and I think sets out the basic premise. How have we reached this point of planetary crisis? It's the outcome of our creaturely quest for survival, the long and continuing struggle for food and shelter that still drives a large part of the human impact on the rest of nature. It is conversely the outcome of the elite pursuit of luxuries, animal, vegetal, and mineral, that has spanned ever more of the world, ever more relentlessly, over the last 500 years. It is the outcome of energy-hungry economic systems, capitalist and socialist alike, that turned living nature into lifeless commodities, sometimes with the liberatory intention of expanding human freedoms. It is the outcome of our inability to imagine kinship with other humans, let alone with other species. It's the outcome of the mutating hydra of militarism, armed with the power to destroy every form of life on Earth. Over time, those roads to ruin have twisted together. To have any hope of undoing the densely woven braid between inequality, violence, and environmental harm, we need to understand its origins.
So, we were talking about this a little while earlier, and I have two questions, and they're both interrelated. Maybe I'll start with the first. What is the role of an environmental historian in times like ours, when we see climate change, but we also see the rise of regional wars? We're not sure what's going to happen to the future. We see inequality on the rise. I think the recent, for instance, killing of the insurance person from the US, and all the conversations around this are exposing an underbelly of inequality leading to violence. And there are many facets of this that we're seeing which could presage the idea of a collapse of the current narrative that economic growth leads to progress. And I think, to me, one of the most important ideas in your book is the fact that it's not that, it questions the premise that economic growth will lead to a trickle-down effect. In fact, what you're saying is that economic growth happens because of inequality, because of exploitation, both of people and the environment. And of course, people have said this before, but I think the examples you chose and the richness of your narrative and the interconnections you draw really brings this out. And so, if you're not talking about that, but actually as what is the role for you of an environmental historian? Is it, because some people say or consider that history is a way, if we understand history, we can predict the future. Do you feel it's that predictive, or is it that you get ideas, or you get a sense of things to watch out for? So what do you feel is the role of books like this, or yourself as an environmental historian, in times of crisis like this?
Great question, Harini, and one that I wrestle with all the time. I think the very last role of history is predictive. I don't think history has predictive value, and I believe that quite strongly, particularly given the radically uncertain paths that we kind of face at the moment. I think where history is meaningful is by analogy, by giving us ways of grappling with our own current uncertainties, by looking to the dilemmas and the choices made by past societies who did not know how things would turn out. I think in some sense the greatest value that we have, because of the distance in time that we have from the societies we study, is to understand that each of these societies grappled with and debated many possible futures, just as we do today, with very incomplete knowledge of the unintended consequences of those choices, with very incomplete knowledge of the extraneous factors that might foreclose some of these possibilities, open up on other possibilities. I think history also teaches us how contingent some of these paths are, that very narrow windows of time can shift in both positive and negative ways political thinking, political possibility, environmental possibilities. And so I think for me, the value of history is not predictive. The value of history at a moment like this, where we face such uncertainty and a wide range of, frankly, dire outcomes, is to understand, first of all, the importance of joined up thinking. So this is an environmental history, but it's an environmental history that has been enriched and has learned from vast traditions of historical scholarship on questions that are not strictly environmental, to do with studies of inequality, studies of empire, studies of conquest and domination. And I think we need that kind of joined up thinking, which is something that a historical perspective can give us, so that we're not isolating, for example, the climate crisis from biodiversity, from inequality, from all of the other questions. And when it comes to the question of war, there is much that I think a historical perspective can teach us. One of them is, it's interesting how little environmentalists have thought about warfare and of all of the obstacles to progress towards a more sustainable path to the future. In a sense, the oldest obstacle, which is warfare, has reasserted itself with a vengeance in the world that we're dealing with today. And in fact, one of the biggest arguments in The Burning Earth is that of all the forces accelerating the planetary crisis, war has loomed very, very large. Weapons of mass destruction have loomed very, very large in giving certain human societies, or those who control them, the power to cause that level of destruction. And I think we've forgotten this. I'm very struck by all of the debates amongst both historians and scientists about when did the Anthropocene begin. Those are rightly debates about energy transitions, they're debates about forms of capitalism. It's striking to me how little they have to say about warfare.
You're absolutely right. And one of the things, I've been talking to other friends who are ecologists, environmentalists, and historians is, what is the climate impact of all the wars that we are seeing? And, and I think I find it striking in none of the IPCC scenarios we have talked about business as usual, including wars. And it seems inevitable in some sense also, if you think of it, that one pathway could win very likely, or could be still very likely in our future. Yeah. So I think those are, to me, the reasons why we need to read books like yours. But also, this takes me to the next question, which was, we're in a world where history has opened up, and some might say history has become more democratic because there are a lot of amateur historians and people from other parts of life who are interested in history starting podcasts, video things, blogs, talking. But there's also the rise of AI, which can, which is summarizing knowledge, and the third is the fact that as you get history democratized, or any form of knowledge democratized, you're also going to have people listening to the right kind of history and the wrong kind of history. And I'm curious if you think there's a right kind of history, or let's put it this way, what do you think your many decades of training as an environmental historian, or a historian specifically, bring to this kind of narrative that, let's say, an AI could do or cannot do, or an amateur historian cannot do or could do, and what conversely would be the strengths of those approaches?
That's a great question. On the whole, I think the democratization of history is something to be celebrated. I think that the plurality of voices that we hear now, the opening up of knowledge production about the past to the kinds of narratives which perhaps professional historians have not paid enough attention to, the opening up of new archives, not only by professional historians, but by community groups, for example. The proliferation of new media, and I think podcasts are a great example. I think, historical podcasts are thriving. They have so many possibilities as ways of imparting knowledge, maybe possibilities that also books don't have. I do worry that as we see, for example, and we see this in the US very much, a very sharp decline in the number of students studying history, a very sharp turn away from the humanities writ large, even in some of their traditional strongholds.
So not just of funding, but of students also?
Students too. The trends in the US since 2008 are really quite stark. History a little bit less so than literature, in fact. There's been an absolute sort of fall off in the number of students, especially in public universities who are studying these things. And those fields have then come under pressure from university administrations who no longer see them as valuable or worth supporting. In that context, I do think we run the risk of losing some very hard-won skills. And that skill, above all, would be the skill of critically sifting different narratives, accepting that there are always going to be different narratives of the past, but to understand that that is not the same as to say that, any version of history is as good as any other version of history. To understand the importance of context, of putting narratives alongside one another, juxtaposing them, connecting them, listening for silences, doing archival work. I mean, that is a skill which, as my own students, some of whom are here, know is very hard work. And the AI is not going to do that for you. In fact, the more we have AI digesting and summarizing those kinds of materials, I think the more, we were talking about this earlier, Harini, we lose the very core of what it is to do historical work, which is to make those connections, to use one's intuition, which is itself honed by years of immersion in the language of the past, in the texture of those materials. And we're sort of outsourcing that to something else.
Because a lot of writing history or speaking about history is what you choose to include and what you choose to exclude. And we were discussing this, I think, as we move to new areas and pick up new themes to study, one of the advantages of being steeped in an area for some time is the serendipitous connections. You use the word idiosyncratic. I would say it's serendipity, but that behind that serendipity is intuition. Yes. And the challenge with the AI algorithms, I suspect, is that they're going to be driven by what the median reader's intuition is. And so the serendipity does not come in. But in the reality is we're going to see many more of these kinds of algorithms influencing what we get, right? So, but from there, I'm going to move to from the issue of choice and selection. Again, you have this very vast width. So I have two questions for you. One is the reality of doing anything like what you've been doing is you're dealing with a lot of very violent histories, very, very shocking, very disturbing things. How did you keep and you were doing most of your research during COVID times. How did you keep your own faith in humanity? Do you have faith in humanity still? How did you keep it alive? And how do you keep it alive in your students? Because I know you also said in the book that this developed out of several classroom discussions you were having with undergraduate students. And we all know that when you teach the very young, you need to be careful not to get too dystopic. And so how did you deal with that for yourself and for your students?
I mean, that's the most profound question that I think I've been wrestling with throughout this process. And I think that my approach to writing The Burning Earth is probably similar to the experience that I hope that readers will have of reading The Burning Earth, which is that sometimes you have to put it down. I don't think that we can or should be thinking about the planetary crisis all the time. I mean, the way that I managed to grapple with the darkness of some of the material that is in this book was also by ensuring, as I think we all do and as activists do, that the sources of meaning and joy in our lives are not sort of restricted to what it is that we're doing when we're sitting and grappling with and dealing with these dark histories. That itself is then what I bring to classroom discussions or my own sense of what is possible, which is to say that it's amazing to have the energy in the room of undergraduates thinking about these questions from their generational perspective. They don't actually find it bleak. I mean, that's one of the most interesting things for me, that I have had one strand of response to The Burning Earth has been, this is a very bleak book. And there is no doubt it details an extraordinary amount of suffering, but I taught a version of this to undergraduates. And in fact, Harsha, who's in the audience, was the brilliant teaching fellow who taught it with me. And that wasn't really the kind of response. I taught most of this material, and the response to it was not, this is too depressing, I don't want to think about it. The instinctive response amongst many of the students, and also in other classes that I taught, was to latch on to the moments of change that there are in this book. was to think about particularly the history of environmental activism in the last part of the 20th century, to find hope and openings in looking at what has been achieved against the formidable odds of enduring disinformation, obstruction, denial that we deal with. That's our reality.
That's, I think, fantastic also. I'm just wondering if this is a good time to ask you to read another section of the book.
Sure.
And I don't know what you have in mind, but maybe even something from one of these movements.
Yeah, let me do that.
You have Ken Saro-Wiwa, but that's one of my favorite sections of the book.
I have Ken Saro-Wiwa. And of course, Ken Saro-Wiwa is a great example of the paradox we face. He paid with his life for his activism. And yet there is a very strong sense in which it has been of lasting value not only to Nigeria, but to the whole world. And so let me read just a couple of paragraphs there. Saro-Wiwa's project of nonviolent resistance failed at home, but remained a beacon of hope to marginalized peoples across the world, in the words of Nigerian environmentalist Godwin Ojo. In the 25 years since his death, Saro-Wiwa's example continues to inspire movements for environmental justice across the global south, as well as in Europe and North America. Saro-Wiwa's activism inspired a slew of claims against Shell, alleging the corporation's culpability for environmental devastation. In March 2012, 11,000 Nigerians from Bodo, Ogoniland, filed a suit against Shell in London, claiming compensation for an oil spill. Shell accepted liability and paid out £55 million. Ken Saro-Wiwa articulated a vision of individual and collective freedom in consonance with the health of the rest of the living planet. Saro-Wiwa's movement was distinctively modern, its language shaped by its place in a global network of activists concerned with human rights and environmental protection. But it also built on older traditions of thought and tapped into deep memories. Its reverberation far beyond the Niger Delta was like a familiar song.
Wonderful. And again, to me, that is what I find so beautiful about this book. It's the rich tapestry, but it's also the richness of your language. I think it brings a certain, to me, poetry alive, and there is the poetry about these landscapes and the people that fight with them. So actually that brings me to one more of the questions that I had for you, and I'll probably, just for the audience, I have 2 or 3 questions more, and I want to make sure I wind up at 11, so we have the last 10 minutes for questions. It's still 11:10? Yeah, okay, so we make sure that we have time for audience questions, because I'm sure there are a lot of people who want to ask you things. But what I wanted to ask you is, as soon as I started the book, I was thinking, this cannot be the result. I mean, so you start by saying you did a lot of the work during the pandemic. I said, this can't be the result of 2 or 3 years of work. This is a very large canvas. And of course, in the acknowledgements, you say that you've been working on this for 20 years. When you work on something like this for 20 years, and with this wealth of material, you can't put all of it into one book. What did you leave out? Is there anything specifically interesting that you left out that you want to tell us about?
So there's a really interesting connection here, Harini, with something you wrote, and this is a piece you wrote in Nature in 2018 on lessons from the Global South for sustainability. And you brought out Elinor Ostrom, great economist. You've in fact won an Elinor Ostrom Award, and Elinor Ostrom was a really interesting thinker in the 1970s, kind of going against the Malthusian consensus, thinking about different forms of common property, thinking about different ways in which local communities can take control of their resources and their futures. And I wish I'd said more about Ostrom. I'd written a whole section about her. I was going to sort of interweave Ostrom with the discussion I have in a chapter where I think about how different thinkers, including Rachel Carson and Hannah Arendt and indeed Indira Gandhi, were grappling with these questions. And that got left out, and that's a pity. But I also am sorry that I must have written twice the length of this book at some point, and I'm sorry for all of the local examples that had to go. And I mean, that's both the potential and the pitfall of writing at this kind of large synoptic scale. Any one of those could have been a book. I hope many of them will be books written by other people, and I think that's my hope here.
will you also be writing articles about these, the sections that you left out?
I hope so.
Yeah, okay, that which would be nice. My one last question before someone was saying, so how long do how we have? How many more minutes? Oh, okay. So then we should open it up. I thought we had 11:10. So my last question is, as a parent, what are your hopes and fears for the future? Because I know this is now something that is getting personal for all of us. I mean, looking at environment and climate and just the future of the world. So what are your hopes and fears?
I mean, that's ultimately why I wrote this book. Because my own children, my son is coming up to 11, it astonished me how powerful their environmental consciousness is growing up in this world today. By the time he was 8 years old, my son was asking me questions about climate change, was asking, how did we end up in this position? My daughter at the age of 6 said to me one night, she goes, why do we destroy the earth if it's our only homeland? And so that partly is what made me think, well, let me take this step beyond what I have researched intensively and empirically to this sort of much larger scale of writing. I do think that their generation has been left a lot to deal with. And there's a really interesting judgment by an Australian judge in 2021. In fact, his judgment was overturned, unfortunately, in which he talked about the climate crisis, broadly speaking, as the greatest intergenerational injustice that one generation has ever left for subsequent generations. But I'm encouraged by the fact that 6- and 7-year-olds around the world, including in the most environmentally irresponsible country in the world, which is the United States of America, have this consciousness and have this really strong sense that that is the cause, that is the burning issue that will shape their lives. And for me, that is humbling. That's more than I had at that age, to be sure.
And I find it fascinating that the student activists, for instance, in Yale, are now pulling out factors like, so for instance, that Princeton is funding an oil company or making Yale divest, and all of these are really, I think, positive hopes for us.
And these movements have all arisen in the last decade. Harvard has actually committed to divesting from fossil fuels thanks entirely to student activism.
Absolutely.
Entirely.
So with that, I just want to make sure we have a few minutes for questions. And do we have maybe a couple of audience questions we can take before we close? There's one. Yeah, you can just say it and I'll repeat it for you.
Both of you mentioned this out as a separate, non-political issue.
I actually don't have any experience with activism, so but I'll leave this to Sunil.
I think my dominant think it's either responsible or viable to try to separate them out completely. I understand there are strategic decisions that activists have to make about which political causes to speak for. I understand that there is also the risk, and this has been particularly manifest with the war in Gaza, that environmentalists have faced a lot of flack for trying to connect the climate crisis or other environmental issues with a particularly divisive conflict. Those are decisions that will continue to confront us. I do not think that the right response to that is to say, well, let's keep environmentalism separate from politics, because I just don't think that's possible.
One more question. Maybe we just have space for one.
Do we have any more questions from the audience?
Yeah, there's one here.
We only know one perspective, so it makes it unreliable, right? Because if we look at the same history from a distant perspective, it's a whole different story.
The idea, and this has in some sense been the most important shift in the historical discipline over the last 50 or 60 years, is that acceptance that every narrative is partial and that any singular narrative is not going to be a faithful representation of how past societies functioned or how past societies made their decisions. But I think if we can embrace history as a practice of telling multiple narratives and not telling them separately, but actually integrating them and bringing them together, then I think that's a very powerful defense against what Chimamanda Adichie very powerfully, I think, called the danger of a single story. And there are many single stories that confront us in the world today. And I think that history, the humanities, including the study of literature and cultural artifacts from around the world, is a very important tool that we have as we start to think about different and hopefully better futures.
Thanks. One last question for you. What comes next after this book?
So the epilogue of The Burning Earth is called Roads to Repair, and I was really keen to make sure that I didn't end the book on a note that diverted attention away from what's throughout the book, which is the fact that there are hundreds and millions of people around the world who are trying to make change, many of whom are making change very effectively at small scales. And I'd like to take that and I'd like to think about it more and I'd like to pursue it and I'd like to tell more of those stories.
That's wonderful, and we hope your sabbatical next year gives you the time for that. So with that, thank you very much.